Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on applying your knowledge. This is the fifth webinar in the How to Design series. Let's go into the breakdown of today's session. So we will be talking about identifying your design output, utilizing your visuals, iconography and infographics, branding and visibility, and the message. So that's the breakdown of today's session, basically. If there are any questions which are Canva related, we'll go to that platform. But if they aren't, just feel free to ask me anything based on today's webinar or the previous webinars, or maybe just any issues you are facing in your day-to-day design output tasks. So identifying your design outputs. So oftentimes we generate a lot of design outputs that aren't necessarily beneficial to the overall project or program goals. So it's always important to identify what those goals are before you generate the design output. Now, much like in television, there are different genres, and it works the same way for design. There can be design for entertainment, design for learning and education, design for behavioral change. So it's important to know what you want your design to do before you start generating that design. And another important thing, which we've touched bases on in our previous webinars, is the audience. So who's going to see it? And when you're talking about who is going to see it, that also speaks to the channels chosen, because different demographics are on different channels, whether it be radio. Radio might reach a older demographic, and whilst that's not directly visual design, you have to design your communication in terms of key messages and what's not. And you have to ask yourself, what should your viewer gain after they see this design output? So that ties into why you're generating it. Is it for entertainment? Is it for education? And all of that informs your design. It informs what you put at the forefront, what you put in the background, what you put to the center, what you put to the left, what you put to the right. So, as I said, it's important to know those project and program goals before you start generating your output. Now, using visuals. So, people will be like, well, use an image. And the word image is used very loosely. But using visuals in your design outputs are based on the who, why, what, and where, and when questions. So should you use a realistic image, or should you use a vector, which many people would align with like a cartoon? So you have to ask yourself these questions. And based on the audience, should this image be graphic? What elements should we explore? What themes? Have you considered the traumas of the people you're speaking to in terms of disaster, visual communications, and things like that? You have to consider your audience when you're going into these design outputs, because if you don't, you run the risk of being offensive. And in our line of work with the IFRC, it's very important that we consider those communities, because those are the communities that we are helping, the vulnerable ones. And have you considered the depiction of the persons that you want to represent? So there's a very thin line between what's appropriate and what can kind of start to veer off into another area, especially when you're dealing with things like disabled communities and sometimes even with race. It's very important to consider these things. They're very touchy topics, but it's what moves your piece from being impactful to being disrespectful. So these are the things that we have to consider when we're designing things. So iconography and infographics. So this is one of my more, no, let's go with iconography is one of my favorite things. Infographics, they're useful, but they have to be used wisely. So iconography can help break up the monotony of text. Um, Most of the time when you open a book, you don't want to see 6 pages of Times New Roman font looking at you because you don't really feel inclined to read that. So icons sometimes help with engaging the viewer and making them feel like, oh, well, there's something else for my eye to focus on. And it's important to align those icons then with some of the most important facts of your piece. So then you have to ask yourself, are these icons relevant to the topic at hand? Are they practical? If someone saw this icon again, would they know? And thematically known, which means with accounting, there's certain icons you'd see. With health, there's certain icons you'd see. So if your theme is health or accounting, it's good to use the icons that are already known because that person basically already has a repertoire and it is more likely that they'd understand what you're trying to communicate. When we talk about infographics, we have to think about our audience yet again, which we think about in all of our design outputs. But is this a better way to disseminate the data that we're communicating on? Different people need different things and have different preferences. So it's all good and well to do infographics, but is that going to be the way that that particular person in that work scenario, is that going to be the way that they absorb the information best? And also, don't create an infographic where you have 20 main points on this infographic and everything is lost in the design because it's too busy. Because again, what is the person supposed to get after viewing this graphic? So you have to be very cautious and basically very informed when you're going about infographics. It's good to really know what the data is saying um, and to use analysis before you even start designing. So we can go into branding and visibility. So I always tell people you don't have to go in, like, you don't have to stay inside the box, but don't go too far. Um, they're guiding principles for us at the IFRC on how we use logos, colors, templates, and these are really important to make sure that we maintain branding guidelines and that we generate a credible brand. The more and more people can, look at something and be like, oh, well, I know who did this, the more credibility you can kind of build for your brand once what you're doing looks good. So there's no need to recreate the wheel. a lot of people, a lot of requests that I've received, people want the visual identity guidelines. How do I use the logo? Can I put it here? Where do I put mine with reference to this logo? So there are guidelines that exist. And if you need those resources, please feel free to reach out to myself or go on the IFRC site. They're all there. So I consider the guidelines the GPS, which is your graphical problem solver. It's a great way to map your outputs and just make sure that everything is to a standard so that there's a continual process of growth amongst your brand that audiences can identify with. So last week, Tiffany would have spoken about communications, and that really, I don't need to go into the messaging because she really went deep into that. So it's just really about your message that you place onto this design output for it to be clear, concise, mapped out, informed, credible, that you're selecting the right channel. It's easy to read, easy to dissect, and it's relatable. You don't want to go into a community with a bunch of flyers of people that don't look like the people in the community. People like to see themselves represented in these materials. It's a very important part of our graphic design outputs. Um, so in a nutshell, what we've covered basically is identifying the necessary design outputs and really dissecting what your project and program goals are and what outputs you need to communicate with the specific audience. Using your visuals, the decision between images and vectors, more cartoon for maybe younger audiences, just basically dissecting things like that. Iconography and infographics, when to use and why to use. Um, if it is to break up the monotony, if it is an easier way for data to be visualized, those are the questions you have to ask yourself. Branding and visibility is so important with the IFRC because the guidelines exist and there's a way to do things. That's the marketing aspect of the whole graphic design communications aspect. It's important that we follow those rules because they exist for a reason. And the message, which you can have the most beautiful output, but if the message is lost, then we haven't done anything, we haven't been effective. So it's important to know your message, ask someone if you don't know. It's good to find out what are the key messages of the entire organization so that there is a standardized approach to this messaging. All of that is very important, and these are the questions that we have to ask. So I just want to know from you guys, are there any Canva related questions? And if they are, we'll head to Canva. So you can put in the chat box if there are any Canva related questions. Based on the last time we went on the platform, is there anything that you guys need? Okay, great. Um, that's good. Clearly, everybody's learning. Um, so I'm going to assume that that means, well, let me not assume. Are there any questions based on today's webinar or the webinars before? Does everyone know where to find the materials? If you don't, If you shoot me a message, I can send you all the necessary resources. And this includes IFRC has tools on the pictures we need to take, the dimensions for those things, visibility guidelines, how to use Twitter, how to use Instagram, how to use Facebook. So there are a lot of communication guidelines and tools online. But if it's a case where you just want me to shoot you an email, feel free to add your email to the chat box and I can send them to you. Yes, there are examples of bad design. Um, yeah, so give me 1 second, let me pull up some. You would have noticed that in the first webinar, Tiffany would have broken down some of the bad designs or designs that didn't really communicate clearly. So I'll show you some as well. Give me 1 second. So here is a great example. Let's share our screen. Right. So I'm sharing my screen and I think everybody should be able to see. So you can literally just Google bad graphic design outputs and you'll see what not to do. The image that we see here on the left, there's way too much going on. Now, it's the first thing that we can pick out, obviously, is the Fast and the Furious with the fire behind it. But usually, I think we all know that Fast and Furious tends to be associated with cars, but you see behind there, there are footsteps or shoe prints, which is kind of confusing if you go based on what we know of that term. Additionally, there's the flag that you usually have when there's car racing. So again, you see that some elements are not well linked to each other. So the methodology that went into designing this is all over the place. Then there's the mixture of some vectors and real images. As you can see, there's the image of the parking lot. Um, that is just not remotely helpful. What does that image do? And we have to be very careful when we mix vectors and real images because it can go badly very quickly if they are not assembled well. Additionally, there are 5 different fonts on this output, and that is a no-no. I often tell people to stick to 2 to 3 fonts or stick to one font with numerous typefaces. And when I say typefaces, I mean italicized, light, bold, things like that, where you have the same style of font, but you're not swaying to like a serif and a sans serif and just putting them together if they're not complementary. So all of those things are important to note. So you see here, this is their logo, which is an awful logo. And that goes back into the branding and visibility. And I don't think that they would have gone over this. I mean, I'm assuming maybe they did. But you have to test your logos on different surfaces, different patterns, and this is important because oftentimes you'll see that people have a logo that's colored, and then they'll change it to white depending on the background or the surface that it's on. So yes, that is important. How do you test your design if you think it looks great? Well, oftentimes, sometimes this is a trial and error situation. And the best people to start with are the internal parties, the people that you work with. Ask them, hey, what do you think about this? Because you'll see a lot of different things start to pop up. People will be like, oh, well, this reminds me of an apple, or this reminds me of a pear, and maybe you never saw it that way. It's always important to get input from the people closest to you before we take things out into the community. Because at the end of the day, the people that work with you are actually the people in the community. These are the people around us. So you can often test things within the office before it even gets too far. Or in our case, you can feel free to send me a design that you work on, ask for input, but I often go with the ask the people in the office, ask the people around you, what do you think about this? And you'll see a lot of different things pop up. And as you make those changes and you get to that final output, you realize, whoa, okay, so this looks really good. This wasn't maybe the original idea I started with, but you're able to dissect those comments and use them for a better output. So let's go back from the screen here and we'll go back to the questions page. Additionally, are there any other questions? Thank you, Arlene, for your questions. Okay, so next week is our last webinar, and something that I've also decided to add to that webinar is going to be a little bit on website design. I know that many NSs and many persons are trying to develop websites, develop apps, improve on the engagement with their Instagrams and Facebooks. So that's something that I will get into next session, which is all about basically keeping it together after you've gained the design knowledge. So it will be important to note that what works on the computer screen doesn't work on the phone screen, and these are the things that we have to consider as well. And next session, I will be joined by Tiffany and Kathleen as we recap on the previous sessions and yeah. Okay, I see another question. I will suggest the Wix website for anybody who wants to generate a website. It is very easy to use, and there's no real coding necessary. And I think coding is usually the first thing that deters people from even getting into websites. So that's usually a site that I would suggest people use. Um, yeah. If there are no further questions, I really want to thank you guys for being here today. Thanks for all the questions, and this webinar will be posted onto YouTube later tonight for anybody who needs to review, and you can go back through the previous webinars as well just to learn more about communications and the CEA approach. Thank you very much. I am Shani Bannister, the graphic design intern, and this has been the second last webinar. So thank you guys.